Mayor Regina Thompson's fingertips traced the familiar contours of her mother's pendant, its smooth silver surface catching the early morning light that streamed through her bathroom window. The piece was simple, a small oval locket with delicate engravings, much like the woman who'd worn it through countless city council meetings in her own time as a civil rights attorney. Always lead with grace, her mother used to say, but never mistake grace for weakness. Regina adjusted her cream-colored sweater, deliberately choosing comfort over power suits. After 3 years as mayor of Liberty Grove, Georgia, she'd learned that approachability often accomplished more than authority. The sweater, paired with charcoal slacks and sensible shoes, sent exactly the message she wanted: competent, confident, and connected to her community. Her phone buzzed against the marble countertop, the screen lighting up with a series of urgent messages. Mayor Thompson, water main break on Cedar Street, affecting approximately 200 households in the Pine Grove district. Regina's heart sank. Pine Grove was the city's lowest-income neighborhood, filled with elderly residents and young families who couldn't afford to miss a day of work. "I'll be there in 20, she typed back to her chief of staff, Marcus. He'd been with her since the campaign, when everyone said a black woman couldn't win in Liberty Grove. They'd proved them wrong with a grassroots campaign that focused on one simple truth: showing up mattered. As she gathered her belongings, Regina caught her reflection in the full-length mirror by her bedroom door. At 42, she wore her success quietly, subtle makeup, her dark hair in a practical shoulder-length cut, and laugh lines that spoke of a leader who believed in finding joy even in challenging moments. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory: "The higher you rise, the more grounded you need to be." The kitchen counter held her usual breakfast spread: a protein smoothie and whole-grain toast prepared by Mrs. Jenkins, her housekeeper of 15 years who become more like family. A handwritten note sat beside the glass: "Added extra protein. You'll need your strength today. Those budget meetings always run long. Love, Joyce." Regina smiled, remembering how Mrs. Jenkins had been there through it all: the late-night campaign strategy sessions, the nail-biting election night, and now the daily challenges of running a city of 75,000 souls. She took a quick sip of the smoothie, banana, berry, and indeed extra protein, while scrolling through her morning briefings. The city council meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. would have to be postponed. The water main break took priority. As she typed out instructions to her assistant, another message popped up: Channel 5 requesting comment on water main situation. They're headed to Cedar Street. Perfect. This was exactly why she maintained a 78% approval rating in a town that had initially been skeptical of her leadership. When crisis struck, Mayor Thompson didn't hide behind press releases or spokesman statements. She showed up, grabbing her emergency kit, a leather messenger bag containing a change of shoes, basic toiletries, and enough granola bars to sustain her through the longest of days. Regina headed for the door. The morning sun painted Liberty Grove in shades of promise, its tree-lined streets and mix of historic buildings and modern development telling the story of a town in transition. Her sensible town car waited in the driveway, eschewing the flashier vehicles some of her predecessors had favored. As she slipped behind the wheel, her mother's pendant caught the light once more. Regina touched it briefly, a habit that had become something of a ritual before facing any challenge. "Time to show up," she whispered to herself, starting the engine and pulling out onto Maple Avenue, unaware that this regular morning was about to become anything but. Cedar Street loomed ahead on Regina's GPS, but her usual route through downtown Liberty Grove had transformed into an obstacle course of orange barrels and construction equipment. The water main crisis messages kept buzzing on her phone, mounted safely on the dashboard. 15 households now without water, read Marcus's latest update. Some elderly residents on oxygen machines requiring consistent water supply. Regina gripped the steering wheel tighter, mentally mapping an alternate route. The construction crew ahead waved vehicles toward a narrow detour down Mason Street, a road she rarely traveled despite her 3 years as mayor. Old oaks created a tunnel of dappled shadows, their branches casting moving patterns across her windshield. A series of traffic signals ahead blinked in seemingly random patterns. The first glowed yellow, while the second alternated between red and dark, its timing off-kilter from recent power grid maintenance. Regina slowed, watching other drivers navigate the confusion with varying degrees of hesitation. A delivery truck ahead of her drove through after a brief pause. Following what appeared to be the traffic flow, Regina proceeded cautiously. The moment her car crossed the intersection, red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, accompanied by a short burst of siren. Her heart sank as she checked her speed. She'd been under the limit. Signaling immediately, she pulled over, positioning her car safely away from the morning traffic. Officer Mike Peterson approached her window with the measured steps of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Regina noticed his wedding ring catching the morning light, a family man doing his job. She'd met him once at a community policing initiative, but doubted he'd remember. She made it a point to blend in at such events, letting the focus stay on the programs rather than her title. "License and registration, ma'am," Officer Peterson requested, his tone professionally detached. As Regina reached for her documents, another message flashed on her dashboard. "Senior Center requesting emergency water delivery." The urgency pressed against her chest like a physical weight. "Officer," Regina began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in difficult council meetings. "I apologize if I misinterpreted the signal." The construction detour led to some confusion with the traffic light patterns. She handed over her license and registration with practiced calm, noting how his eyes flickered briefly over her address, Mayo Manor, the official residence she'd initially resisted accepting. "Ma'am, the signal was red," Officer Peterson stated, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty. He glanced from her documents to her face, then back again, his professional demeanor wavering slightly. "Are you related to Judge Thompson from the Superior Court?" "No," Regina replied simply, resisting the urge to mention her position. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Your character speaks louder than your credentials." The officer shifted his weight, pen hovering over his citation pad. "The signal has been malfunctioning since the power work last week," he admitted, "but regulations require us to treat it as a standard red light when uncertain." Regina nodded, understanding the bind. As mayor, she'd signed off on that very policy, prioritizing safety over convenience. The irony wasn't lost on her. Another message lit up her dashboard: press arriving at Cedar Street. Officer Peterson wrote the citation with methodical precision, his earlier uncertainty hidden behind protocol. "You can contest this in traffic court if you believe there were extenuating circumstances," he explained, handing her the yellow slip along with her documents. "The courthouse has been backed up lately, but they're usually pretty fair about considering evidence." Regina accepted the citation gracefully, already knowing she'd appear in court, not to pull rank, but because someone needed to address the construction zone's signage issues before they caused a serious accident. As Officer Peterson returned to his patrol car, her phone buzzed again. The water main crisis couldn't wait. Starting her engine, Regina merged back into traffic, the citation on her passenger seat serving as a reminder that sometimes leadership meant accepting the same inconveniences faced by those you served. The GPS recalculated her route to Cedar Street, where 200 households and a growing media presence awaited their mayor's arrival. No excuses, no special treatment, just showing up when needed. 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Regina sat on a worn wooden bench in the Liberty Grove County Courthouse, her mother's pendant warm against her collarbone. The morning light filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes in its beam and casting long shadows across the marble floor. She deliberately arrived early, choosing to experience the justice system exactly as her constituents did. No special entrance, no preferential treatment. The courthouse lobby hummed with nervous energy. A young mother ahead of her struggled with a baby carrier in one hand and a stack of crumpled papers in the other, her face pinched with worry as her infant began to fuss. The woman's name tag identified her as a cafeteria worker at Liberty Grove High, Maria Delgado, scheduled for the 9:30 docket just like Regina. Without hesitation, Regina stood and approached Maria. "Those forms can be tricky," she offered, gesturing to the paperwork. "Would you like some help?" The younger woman's relief was immediate, though she didn't recognize the mayor in casual business attire. Together, They worked through the bureaucratic maze of traffic court documentation, Regina's familiarity with city protocols helping to simplify the process. Nearby, an elderly man in a carefully pressed but outdated suit kept checking and rechecking his summons, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "Excuse me, sir," Regina heard a clerk snap from behind the information desk. "I've already told you twice. Courtroom B is on the second floor." The man, who Regina recognized as Mr. Chen from the downtown pharmacy, blinked in confusion at the complex directory posted on the wall. Rising again, Regina approached him. "Mr. Chen, I'm heading to courtroom B myself. Would you like to walk together?" The old pharmacist's eyes lit with recognition, but before he could address her formally, she added quietly, "Just Regina today." His grateful nod spoke volumes about dignity and respect in a place that often stripped both away. A teenager paced nearby, constantly adjusting his tie, likely his father's, given how it dwarfed his thin frame. Regina overheard snippets of his phone conversation. "Mom, I can't be late to court, but Mr. Harris says he'll fire me if I miss another shift." The boy's anxiety was palpable, his youth starkly apparent against the institutional backdrop. As Regina waited, she observed the systematic inefficiencies around her. The signage was confusing, the forms unnecessarily complex, and the staff clearly overworked. A single clerk attempted to manage a growing line while answering phones and filing paperwork. These were the details that never made it into official reports but affected citizens' daily lives profoundly. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings. Several people shot irritated looks at Maria, who tried desperately to soothe her child while maintaining her place in line. Regina retrieved a small stuffed elephant from her bag, a good luck charm from her niece that she'd started carrying during campaign season. "Sometimes a new friend helps," she offered, demonstrating the toy's squeezable ears. The baby's cries transformed into curious coos. Time ticked by with bureaucratic sluggishness. Regina watched as people from all walks of life filtered through security. Landscapers still in work boots, nurses in scrubs trying to make it before their shifts, retirees clutching papers with trembling hands. Each face told a story of how justice system interactions could disrupt lives, drain resources, and chip away at human dignity. When the courtroom doors finally opened, Regina found herself last in line, having spent the waiting time helping others navigate the system. As she prepared to enter, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her mother's pendant, her purposefully modest attire, her expression composed but determined. In just a few moments, she would face Judge Harrison not as a mayor, but as one citizen among many. And perhaps that, she reflected, was exactly as it should be. Courtroom B operated with the mechanical efficiency of an assembly line. Judge William Harrison sat elevated behind his bench, steel-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed. He wielded his gavel like a conductor's baton, setting the rhythm of justice at allegro, swift, sharp, and without pause for nuance. Regina sat in the third row, observing as the cases before hers unfolded. Maria Delgado approached the podium, baby mercifully asleep against her shoulder. "Your Honor, I was rushing to get my sick child to the doctor." The gavel fell before she could finish. The light was red, Mrs. Delgado. "The circumstances of your violation don't change its nature. $200, payable within 30 days. Judge Harrison's words carried the weight of routine, his eyes never leaving the papers before him. Maria's shoulders slumped as she turned away, calculating month's groceries against the fine. Mr. Chen shuffled forward next, his pressed suit suddenly seeming to hang more loosely on his frame. "Your Honor," the sign was covered by tree branches. "I couldn't." "Mr. Chen," the judge interrupted, checking his watch with barely concealed impatience. "The city maintains its signage adequately. Your failure to observe it is not the court's concern. $150. The teenage boy with the oversized tie approached, his work boots squeaking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, I can explain." "The court doesn't require an explanation, Mr. Parker. The officer's documentation is quite clear, $175. Judge Harrison's stamp fell with methodical precision, each case reduced to a transaction, each story compressed into a fine amount. Regina watched as Justice, supposedly blind, seemed to peek through her blindfold just enough to size up each defendant's worth in quick, dismissive glances. She noticed how the judge's tone shifted subtly when addressing the occasional white-collar professional, slightly more patient, marginally more engaged. Next case. Thompson, Regina. Traffic signal violation, Cedar Street and Mason Avenue. Rising with deliberate grace, Regina smoothed her charcoal slacks and approached the podium. The same podium where Maria had stood, where Mr. Chen had pleaded, where young Parker had tried to explain. Her mother's pendant felt heavy against her chest, a reminder of generations of dignity in the face of dismissal. Judge Harrison didn't look up from his papers, his voice carrying the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized the morning's proceedings. "Another routine traffic violation," he muttered, more to himself than the court. "Citation indicates failure to observe a traffic signal during construction detour." His pen hovered over the form, already calculating the fine. Regina stood straight, her posture refined by years of city council meetings and public appearances. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured. "The court is aware that construction can be confusing, Ms. Thompson." He cut in, still not looking up. "But the law remains the law, regardless of temporary inconvenience." The irony of his words, "the law remains the law," echoed in Regina's mind. She thought of Maria's sick child, Mr. Chen's confusion, young Parker's desperate attempt to keep his job. The law might remain the law, but its application seemed to bend like a reed in the wind of prejudice and presumption. "If you have a prepared statement," Judge Harrison continued, shuffling papers with practiced indifference, "please keep it brief. The court has a full docket this morning." Regina's fingers brushed her mother's pendant, drawing strength from its familiar contours. In that moment, she wasn't Mayor Thompson with a 78% approval rating or the first Black woman to lead Liberty Grove. She was simply a citizen in his courtroom, watching justice dispense itself with assembly line precision, and wondering how many others had stood here, their stories unheard, their dignity under siege. Regina's voice carried the quiet authority she'd honed through countless city council debates, each word measured and precise. "Your Honor, I'd like to address not just my citation, but a matter of public safety concerning the intersection in question." Judge Harrison's pen paused mid-stroke, his sigh audible enough to carry to the back of the courtroom. "Miss Thompson, this is traffic court, not a town hall meeting. We deal with violations, not infrastructure critiques." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Regina continued, undeterred. "The citation stems from a recently implemented detour on Mason Avenue, where construction has obscured normal traffic patterns." She reached into her folder, withdrawing photographs she'd taken the day after her citation. "If I may submit these as evidence." "Ms. Thompson," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for those he deemed unnecessarily difficult. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Construction zones require extra vigilance, not creative interpretations of traffic signals." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maria Delgado, still cradling her sleeping baby, leaned forward slightly. Mr. Chen's eyes darted between the judge and Regina, recognition finally dawning on his weathered face. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Regina persisted, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "Grace under fire is your superpower. The issue isn't about vigilance, but about public safety and proper municipal communication during infrastructure updates." Judge Harrison finally looked up, but only to check his watch. "Perhaps, Ms. Thompson, if you're confused by basic traffic signals, you should consider leaving earlier for your appointments." His words dripped with condescension, each syllable a subtle jab at her competence. Regina's fingers brushed her mother's pendant, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "The timing of my journey isn't at issue, Your Honor. The city's obligation to provide clear, unambiguous traffic guidance is." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the hushed courtroom. "According to Municipal Code Section 47.3, construction zones require redundant signage when primary traffic signals are affected." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise at her knowledge of city codes quickly masked by increased irritation. "Ms. Thompson, are you attempting to lecture this court on municipal law?" "No, Your Honor. I'm presenting relevant context for this case and 17 similar citations issued at the same intersection over the past week." Regina maintained eye contact, her posture straight but not confrontational. Context that speaks to a systemic issue rather than individual infractions. Judge Harrison's knuckles whitened around his pen. "The court is not interested in your amateur legal analysis. The fact remains that you failed to observe a signal that, according to the Department of Transportation's own guidelines, was improperly maintained during active construction." Regina completed the sentence, her tone remaining respectful but firm. "A situation that poses an ongoing risk to public safety." The judge's face flushed slightly. "Ms. Thompson, I'm beginning to find your attitude contemptuous. This is a simple traffic violation, not a platform for your personal crusade about city planning." In the gallery, young Parker had stopped fidgeting with his tie, transfixed by the exchange. Even the courthouse clerk had paused her paperwork, pen hovering above unfinished forms. "Your Honor," Regina continued, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used in hundreds of policy meetings. "As someone responsible for the safety of our citizens, I cannot in good conscience treat this as a simple violation when it represents a broader public safety concern." Judge Harrison's patience visibly frayed. "And what exactly qualifies you to make such assessments about public safety, Ms. Thompson? Are you perhaps a traffic engineer, or just another citizen who believes their Google research trumps legal authority?" Regina squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of every dismissive comment, every condescending glance that had preceded this moment. Her response would change the entire dynamic of the courtroom, but first, she let the judge's words hang in the air, a testament to the assumptions that had guided his treatment of every defendant that morning. Regina's voice remained steady as she replied, "Actually, Your Honor, my qualifications stem from my current position as mayor of Liberty Grove, where I've spent the past 3 years overseeing all municipal operations, including traffic safety and infrastructure development." The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of reaction. Judge Harrison's head snapped up so quickly his reading glasses slipped down his nose. The pen he'd been wielding with such authority clattered onto his desk, leaving a small blue mark on the citation form. For a moment, the perpetual hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening in the silence. In the gallery, Maria Delgado's baby chose this precise moment to coo softly, the sound carrying through the stunned quiet. Mr. Chen straightened in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Judge Harrison's complexion shifted from authoritative pink to a mottled red, then settled into an uncomfortable pallor. His mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to speak. "Mayor Thompson." The title seemed to stick in his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." Regina maintained her composed stance at the podium, neither triumphant nor apologetic. "I had intended to address the court purely on the merits of the traffic safety issue, but since you question my qualifications." She let the sentence hang delicately in the air. The young clerk who had been documenting the proceedings dropped her stenotype pencil, the clatter echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She scrambled to retrieve it, face flushing as she realized she'd become part of the scene unfolding before her. Judge Harrison tugged at his collar, his other hand instinctively reaching to straighten his already straight tie. We weren't informed of your, that is to say, the court wasn't aware of your position." His earlier condescension had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. "My position shouldn't be relevant to the fair application of justice, Your Honor." Regina's words carried to every corner of the suddenly attentive courtroom, just as it shouldn't have been relevant for Ms. Delgado, Mr. Chen, or Mr. Parker. From his elevated bench, Judge Harrison seemed to shrink slightly. His eyes darted to the other defendants she'd named, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The teenage Parker had stopped fidgeting with his borrowed tie entirely, his expression a mixture of awe and vindication. "Of course," the judge stammered, shuffling papers with trembling hands. "The court strives to be impartial in all cases." The words rang hollow against the memory of his earlier dismissive treatment. Regina opened her folder again, extracting a detailed report. Perhaps now would be an appropriate time to discuss the comprehensive traffic safety analysis I've brought, which includes data on accident rates at modified intersections during construction periods. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Harrison visibly grappled with his new reality. His earlier assertion that the law remains the law hung unspoken between them, its meaning transformed by the shifting power dynamic. A subtle movement caught Regina's eye. Maria Delgado was smiling while wiping away quiet tears, perhaps seeing in this moment a glimpse of justice more equitable than she dared to hope for. Mr. Chen sat straighter in his chair, his dignity visibly restored. "The court will." Judge Harrison paused, removing his glasses to polish them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed more about buying time than cleaning lenses. "The court will hear your analysis, Mayor Thompson." Regina nodded graciously, her mother's pendant catching the fluorescent light. In that moment, she wasn't just presenting evidence about a traffic signal. She was demonstrating how justice should work for everyone who walked through these doors, title or no title. The irony that it took revealing her position to make her voice heard wasn't lost on her. If anything, it reinforced the importance of what would come next. Judge Harrison's attempt to regain control of his courtroom was painful to watch. "Mayor Thompson," he began, half rising from his chair, "had I known of your position earlier." His voice carried the desperate tone of a man suddenly aware he'd been digging his own grave with every dismissive word. Regina raised her hand in a gesture familiar to anyone who'd attended her city council meetings, palm forward, firm, but not aggressive. The motion silenced him mid-sentence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of every citizen who'd stood at this podium before her. "My title doesn't make the traffic signals any clearer, nor does it make this morning's proceedings any more acceptable." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a subtle rustling moved through the gallery. Cell phones emerged discreetly from pockets and purses, their owners sensing a moment worth documenting. The young clerk's fingers hovered over her stenotype, torn between professional duty and personal amazement. "I've sat in this courtroom for the past 2 hours," Regina continued, her words measured and clear. "I've watched a mother trying to balance childcare with civic responsibility be dismissed without consideration. I've seen an elderly businessman's valid concerns about obscured signage brushed aside. A young man's employment situation was deemed irrelevant to these proceedings." Judge Harrison's face fluctuated between shades of embarrassment as each example struck home. His hand moved unconsciously to straighten his already perfect tie, a nervous tic that hadn't been present during his earlier authoritarian demeanor. "But what troubles me most," Regina pressed on, "isn't the individual dismissals. It's the systematic efficiency with which this court has processed human beings like paperwork, reducing their stories to stamp marks and dollar amounts." From the gallery, Maria Delgado sniffled quietly, clutching her baby closer. Mr. Chen nodded slowly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Young Parker had completely abandoned his tie fidgeting, sitting forward with an expression of dawning hope. "Mayor Thompson," Judge Harrison attempted again, his voice adopting a conciliatory tone that hadn't been present for any previous cases, "the court appreciates your unique perspective on municipal matters." "My perspective isn't unique, Your Honor," Regina interrupted, touching her mother's pendant. "It's shared by every citizen who walks through those doors seeking justice, not judgment. The only difference is, my position makes you listen to it." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably, unable to maintain his usual stoic expression. The court clerk had given up any pretense of normal procedure, her documentation forgotten as she watched the scene unfold. "Perhaps," Judge Harrison offered weakly, "we could discuss these concerns in chambers." "No, Your Honor," Regina replied firmly. "These issues deserve the same public forum where they occurred. The same transparency we demand from our citizens should apply to our institutions." She opened her folder again, retrieving a series of photographs. "Now, regarding the specific safety concerns at Cedar Street and Mason Avenue, I've brought documentation of 17 similar incidents in the past week alone. But before we address those, I believe we have some previous cases to reconsider." The judge's gavel lay untouched, its authority temporarily suspended in the face of a different kind of power, not the power of position, but of truth spoken with unwavering conviction. The morning's assembly line of justice had ground to a halt, replaced by something far more meaningful. Through the courthouse windows, sunlight had finally broken through the morning clouds, casting long rays across the proceedings. Regina stood in one of these beams, her mother's pendant catching the light, as she prepared to transform a personal moment of vindication into systemic change. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Regina stood at the intersection of Cedar Street and Mason Avenue, now equipped with state-of-the-art traffic signals and clear construction zone protocols. The morning sun caught her mother's pendant as she addressed a small crowd of reporters and community members gathered for the unveiling of Liberty Grove's new Judicial Accountability Initiative. Change, she began, her voice carrying across the assembled group, doesn't come from avoiding uncomfortable moments, but from transforming them into opportunities for systemic improvement. Her eyes found familiar faces in the crowd. Maria Delgado, now employed as the courthouse's first bilingual community liaison. Mr. Chen, serving on the newly formed Citizens Advisory Board, and young Parker, wearing a properly fitted tie as part of his internship with the City Planning Department. Behind her, the intersection's new signal system blinked with precise clarity, each light accompanied by digital countdown timers and supplementary signage in multiple languages. Construction crews worked efficiently nearby, following updated protocols that prioritized both safety and clear communication with the public. Judge William Harrison sat in the front row of folding chairs, his posture notably different from that day in court. The past 6 months had changed him too. After that pivotal morning, he'd not only dismissed the pending citations from the problematic intersection, but had also voluntarily enrolled in the city's first judicial bias training program. When I paid my fine that day, Regina continued, drawing surprised murmurs from those who hadn't known this detail, it wasn't about accepting an unjust situation. It was about acknowledging that true leadership means working within the system to change it, not seeking personal exceptions. The fine receipt, framed alongside the original citation, now hung in City Hall's newly established Office of Public Accountability. Below it, a plaque read, "Justice sees no titles." Today, we're not just celebrating improved traffic signals. Regina gestured to the intersection behind her. We're marking the 6-month milestone of our judicial reform initiative. She began listing the changes: mandatory bias training for court officials, a new court observation program staffed by community volunteers, simplified forms available in multiple languages, and extended court hours to accommodate working families. The courthouse itself had undergone a transformation. The worn wooden benches had been replaced with comfortable seating, clear signage guided visitors in multiple languages, and a supervised children's area offered respite for parents attending proceedings. The assembly line justice of that morning 6 months ago had given way to something more humane. Judge Harrison rose when Regina acknowledged him, his face carrying the humility of hard-earned wisdom. Our court system, he addressed the crowd, had forgotten its primary purpose, to serve justice, not just process cases. Mayor Thompson, he turned to Regina, reminded us that behind every citation, every case number, stands a human being worthy of dignity and fair consideration. Regina touched her mother's pendant, thinking of how its lesson about grace had guided her through that transformative morning. The changes hadn't come easily. Each improvement had faced resistance. Each reform had required persistence, but the results spoke for themselves. Court satisfaction ratings had improved by 60%, citation contests were down by 40%, and compliance with traffic regulations had actually increased once people trusted the system's fairness. The true measure of justice, Regina concluded, isn't in how we treat those with power and position, but in how we serve every member of our community. She looked out at the gathered faces, citizens, officials, and press all mixed together under the morning sun. This intersection once represented a failure in our system. Today, it stands as a symbol of what we can achieve when we acknowledge our mistakes and commit to genuine change. As if on cue, the new traffic signal cycled through its colors, each transition clear and unambiguous. The morning sun caught the fresh paint of the crosswalk stripes, the updated signage, and the faces of those gathered, all part of a community that had learned to see justice through new eyes, reminded that sometimes the most powerful leadership comes from those moments when titles fall away and humanity rises up.